Clay Arden thought he was buying an abandoned desert hangar, 9 dust-covered supercars, and 3 unclaimed helicopters. For a single father running on his last reserve of savings, it was nothing more than a chance to rebuild. A repair shop in the middle of nowhere, far enough from failure to try again. But when Serafina Wycliffe stepped through that corrugated steel door, she did not look at the vehicles worth millions of dollars. She went completely still in front of the silver helicopter at the far end of the hangar. It bore a crescent scratch near the hatch, one she had made herself as a child, on the aircraft that had been reported destroyed alongside her father 17 years ago. Stay until the end to discover what that silver helicopter had been hiding about the night her father died. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in late October, in a stretch of Nevada desert where the horizon was flat enough to make a man feel like the world had no edges. The property listing described the site as a former private testing airfield with 1 primary hangar, a deteriorating secondary structure, 3-phase electrical service still intact, and an access road that had not been graded in close to 8 years. Creditors had been circling the estate of vein recovery and testing for the better part of 2 years, and the bankruptcy court had finally cleared the asset for public sale after a protracted dispute over environmental assessments and unresolved title questions on the underlying land. Most of the bidders present that morning were commercial developers who had driven out from Las Vegas and Reno to look at the acreage, not the building. Men in clean boots who squinted at the hangar and saw remediation costs and liability exposure rather than square footage and potential. One of them told his partner loud enough for the whole group to hear that the soil under the fuel line had almost certainly soaked up 30 years of aviation-grade contamination, and the hangar roof looked like it had been losing sheet metal to every windstorm since the last administration. Clay Arden stood at the edge of that group with a manila envelope tucked under his arm and said nothing. He was 43 years old, 2 years removed from the collapse of the aircraft maintenance contractor that had employed him for the better part of a decade, and 18 months into a living arrangement that required his daughter Paige to stay with her aunt in Henderson while he figured out how to stop the bleeding. He had driven out the night before and slept in his truck because he could not afford a motel room and still meet the reserve bid, and during those few hours before dawn he had walked the perimeter of the fence line with a flashlight and counted things that the other bidders had not bothered to look for: a transformer box that was still locked by the power company, conduit runs that had not been stripped for copper, and a hangar slab that showed no visible settling cracks along its southern edge. The people who saw only a wreck saw it because they had not needed it badly enough to look closer. He submitted the only serious bid of the morning, using nearly every dollar of savings he had left, a small loan against his truck, and a verbal commitment from a mechanic in Boulder City who agreed to become a minority partner if the property checked out structurally. The auctioneer read the number back twice, glanced at the developers to see if anyone would counter, and when no one moved, brought the gavel down with the mild satisfaction of a man who had expected the day to go longer. Clay did not celebrate. He walked to his truck, called his attorney to begin the title transfer, then drove back to the gate and stood in front of it for a long time thinking about Paige, and whether this was the thing that would finally stop the slide or the thing that finished it. The padlock on the hangar door had corroded into its shackle and took 20 minutes and a bolt cutter to open. What Clay found on the other side of that door stopped him at the threshold for a full minute before he moved again. 9 vehicles rested under canvas tarps arranged in 2 rows, their profiles suggesting low rooflines and wide stances, with the unmistakable silhouette of high-performance bodywork visible even beneath the fabric. Beyond them, separated by a steel partition wall that had been added after the original hangar construction, 3 helicopters sat on their skids in a row, one of them catching the shaft of afternoon light through a cracked panel in the roof and throwing it back in silver. Every vehicle had been raised off the concrete on proper storage pads. Every fuel system had been treated with stabilizer, and every battery had been disconnected and bagged in insulating wrap, which told Clay with absolute certainty that whoever had stored these machines had not done it in a hurry and had not expected them to stay here forever. He pulled a single corner of the nearest tarp and saw paint that had not faded and bodywork with no collision damage, then let the fabric drop and did not touch another vehicle. He called his attorney from the middle of the hangar floor and told her what he was looking at, and she told him not to run the chassis numbers himself, not to contact any potential buyers, and not to speak to anyone about the contents of the building until she had filed the appropriate inquiries with the state registry and the FAA. Clay agreed, walked back to the silver helicopter at the far end of the row, and stood there in the lowering desert light, and that was when he noticed the badge along the tail boom, a stylized letter W, barely visible under a coat of gray primer that had been applied over the original finish without fully stripping the embossed metal beneath it. The photograph that leaked came from a real estate assessment filed with the bankruptcy court, a single frame from a wide-angle property survey that captured the covered vehicles in the background, and within 48 hours of the auction, it had been pulled and reposted by enough automotive enthusiasts that Clay's phone began ringing before he had even changed the padlock on the gate. Collectors called from California, Florida, and twice from overseas, and the offers that came through his attorney were immediate and serious, ranging from low 6 figures for individual vehicles sight, unseen to one buyer who offered a flat amount for the entire contents of the hangar without a single question about provenance. Clay declined every call and instructed his attorney to do the same, because he had worked in vehicle restoration long enough to know that a machine with no traceable history and no clean title was not a treasure but a trap, and a trap you could not afford to walk into when you were already one bad month from losing everything. His attorney filed requests with the Nevada DMV, the FAA Aircraft Registry, and 2 federal surplus asset databases, and within 72 hours the responses began to clarify what Clay had already suspected from the condition and quality of the vehicles. 3 of the 9 bore chassis configurations that matched no production model he could identify, with suspension geometry and drivetrain placements that suggested prototype engineering, while 2 others showed roll cage installations and instrument clustering consistent with high-speed test programs. The 6th vehicle, a low, narrow roadster with a hand-tooled interior and a steering wheel that had been custom-fitted to a specific driver's grip, was unlike anything built for commercial sale. None of the 9 had current registrations, and most had no title chain that extended past a single internal transfer document from within a corporate fleet. Inside the silver helicopter, Clay found a maintenance logbook tucked beneath the co-pilot's seat. Most of its pages were intact, but a section near the back had been carefully removed, not torn, but separated at the binding with a precision instrument, leaving clean edges and no fragments. The identification plate mounted in the instrument bay gave a tail number that his attorney's records matched to an aircraft flagged in the federal database as destroyed, consumed by fire in a remote section of the Nevada desert 17 years before the date of this auction, with no surviving airframe. He read the entry again, and then read it a 3rd time, standing in the helicopter with the afternoon heat pressing through the fuselage skin. He filed an FAA inquiry that afternoon and received an automated acknowledgement. The following morning, before the inquiry had been processed, his phone rang with a number that traced back to the legal offices of Wycliffe Aerospace and Mobility, one of the largest aerospace and automotive conglomerates in the western United States. The woman on the line identified herself as Merritt Vale, chief legal officer, and informed Clay in measured language that the contents of the hangar constituted proprietary assets and trade secrets that had been removed from Wycliffe Aerospace without authorization, and that he was required to cease all access, documentation, and contact with third parties regarding those assets immediately. She did not provide a chassis number list. She did not provide ownership records. She did not provide a single document to support the assertion. Clay thanked her for the call, asked his attorney to log the contact, and told her he would be happy to cooperate with any request that came with proper legal standing and a matching paper trail. Merritt Vale told him he was opposing a company valued at several $billions. Clay said he was aware of that, and ended the call. The next morning, a convoy of black vehicles appeared at the end of the access road, and a woman in a charcoal blazer stepped out of the lead car. Serafina Wycliffe entered the hangar with the focused composure of someone who had spent the drive preparing to be professionally unmoved by whatever she found on the other side of that gate. She was 39 years old, CEO of Wycliffe Aerospace for 4 years, and she had reviewed the inventory photographs her legal team had pulled from the court filing, identifying at least 4 vehicles that should not have existed outside a Wycliffe engineering archive. Clay met her at the entrance and allowed access on 2 explicit conditions. She could observe any vehicle and photograph from a distance, but she could not operate any system, remove any component, or authorize any other person to do so, while the question of ownership remained under review. Serafina accepted those terms in a tone that suggested she found them mildly inconvenient, and they walked into the hangar together in the particular silence of 2 people being careful with each other. She moved through the first row of vehicles with the focused attention of someone cataloging rather than admiring, noting chassis configurations and bodywork without pausing, and Clay stayed a few steps behind and said nothing. Then she reached the steel partition wall and passed through the gap into the second section of the hangar, and she stopped. The silver helicopter sat at the far end, catching the overhead fluorescence in its fuselage panels, and for several seconds, Serafina did not move at all. When she finally stepped forward, she moved slowly, the way a person moves when they are not certain the thing in front of them is real. She reached the fuselage and placed 2 fingers against a crescent-shaped mark in the metal, near the hatch locking mechanism, a shallow gouge about 3 inches long, curved at one end, pressed into the aluminum with just enough force to catch paint. When she was 7 years old, she had ridden her bicycle inside her father's private hangar and caught the handlebar end against the fuselage of his personal aircraft, and Augustus Wycliffe had crouched down beside the scratch and told her he was not going to have it repainted, because it meant the helicopter belonged to their family and not just to the company. That mark had been on the aircraft the last time she saw it, and the aircraft had then been recorded as having burned to nothing in the Nevada desert on the night of November 4th, 17 years prior. She stepped up through the open hatch and stood in the cockpit for a long time. The stitching on the pilot's seat was a pattern her father had specified, a diagonal cross-stitch in burgundy on dark gray leather that no standard manufacturer had offered in that configuration. The compass above the instrument panel was a mechanical unit from a maker that had stopped production before her father died, installed at his specific request because he did not trust electronic navigation for low-altitude desert work. And behind the co-pilot instrument array, written in permanent marker on the bare aluminum skin of the forward bulkhead, were 9 words in her father's handwriting that she recognized the way she would have recognized his voice. The machine flies honest when the builder was honest. She turned and told Clay that someone had constructed an extremely convincing replica. Clay replied, in the same even tone she had used with him that he would welcome the opportunity to have an independent forensic examiner review the airframe material dating, the paint layers, and the fastener corrosion profile, and that he would strongly suggest the examiner not be anyone affiliated with Wycliffe Aerospace or any company in its supply chain. He reached down and removed a maintenance access panel from the lower fuselage, exposing the structural identification stamps in the interior framing, and pointed to a number running in a sequence corresponding to the aircraft designation she had grown up hearing her father use. The paint above it was 2 years newer than the paint below it, and the original stamp beneath had not been ground out, only covered. She told him about the night her father died in a way that suggested she had not told the story to anyone in a long time. Augustus Wycliffe had been flying to a remote test facility for an emergency board meeting, traveling alone in what the filed report identified as his personal aircraft, tail number consistent with the registration of the machine now standing in front of them. The helicopter had gone down in unlit terrain approximately 40 miles from the facility, and by the time the search team reached the site, the fuselage had burned past the point of structural recognition, with identification made through tail number remnants in the recovered metal and partial instrument housing. No mechanical cause had been definitively established, and the official report cited probable pilot error under deteriorating visual conditions. Clay spread the maintenance logbook on the nose cowl and showed her where the entries stopped. The final recorded entry was dated 3 days before the accident. A full rotor assembly replacement with parts listed under a batch number and a notation from the technician indicating the new components had been installed per a work order issued from the engineering department. There was no second signature confirming the installation had been inspected and cleared, which was a standard requirement for any rotor work on a registered aircraft. The signature line had been left blank. He pointed to the blank and then pointed to the batch number and said he would like to know who had issued that work order. Laurel Ames arrived 2 days later at Clay's request. She was 51 years old, a forensic aviation engineer who had worked accident reconstruction for insurance carriers and federal bodies for more than 2 decades, and she had been removed from the original Wycliffe Accident Investigation Panel approximately 3 weeks before the final report was published, ostensibly due to a scheduling conflict on another engagement. She had her own records, and she had kept them. She walked through the helicopter with a structured checklist and spent 4 hours examining the airframe before she said a single word about what she was finding. And what she said was that this airframe had never experienced fire damage at any structural point, that the corrosion and wear patterns throughout were consistent with a machine that had been stored rather than operated, and that the alloy composition was consistent with a manufacturing batch she had traced to a single production run that had produced exactly 1 aircraft registered to Wycliffe Aerospace under this designation. Laurel said she had requested a secondary identification check during the original investigation because she believed the burned wreckage tail number might have been stenciled rather than stamped. She had been told the request was outside her scope. She had filed a dissenting note that never appeared in the final published report. Serafina listened to this in the hangar doorway with one hand against the frame and the expression of someone doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. She said that if the helicopter her father had flown was not his helicopter, then he had been placed in a different aircraft without her mother or his executive team being informed, and she wanted to know who had the authority to authorize that substitution. Clay said nothing for a moment. Then he walked to the second helicopter, the Falcon testbed, and ran his hand along the main rotor hub housing. He pointed to a small notation scratched into the metal in a hurried hand, 2 numbers separated by a slash. 17, not 17. He had not understood it the first time he noticed it. Standing there now, he thought he might. They worked methodically through the remaining vehicles over the following 3 days. Laurel with her measurement tools and tablet, Clay with a flashlight, and the quiet patience of a man who had spent his career reading what machines had been through by the evidence they left in their own metal. It became clear within the first afternoon that Cyrus Vane had not assembled this collection out of passion for automobiles. The vehicles had been selected with the deliberate logic of an engineer preserving a chain of evidence. Each one contained components, documentation, or material samples that connected to a single thread running back through a network of suppliers, contracts, and internal approvals. The cars were not trophies, they were a filing system. The 3 Vesper prototypes had never been shown publicly. Their design language was a full generation beyond the models that Wycliffe Aerospace's mobility division had released before the program was quietly shelved. Each one used a suspension control module and a primary structural bonding compound sourced from a supplier called Northstar Dynamics, whose name also appeared in the maintenance records of the Falcon testbed alongside the batch number associated with the rotor components. The 2 race-configured vehicles contained testing instruments that had recorded load and stress data during high-speed runs, and the data was still present on their internal logging systems in a format that could be extracted with the right interface. Laurel spent the better part of a morning doing exactly that, while Clay worked on the Roadster. The Roadster was the one Augustus Wycliffe had built for himself. The interior was fitted to specific dimensions. The steering column was adjusted for a particular reach, and certain gauges on the dashboard had been rotated slightly from their standard positions. Not by accident, but to form a precise angular alignment across 3 dial faces. Clay tried combinations. The third one he attempted opened a recessed panel beneath the center console with the quiet click of a well-made mechanical lock. Inside was a sealed document envelope, and inside that envelope were materials that changed the character of everything in the hangar. A numbered list of batch deliveries from Northstar Dynamics cross-referenced against contracts assigned to Wycliffe Aerospace defense and commercial aviation programs. A set of test photographs showing rotor components with hairline fractures along the bonding seam of the alloy insert, and a handwritten summary that identified the problem with clinical precision. Northstar Dynamics had substituted a lower-grade alloy compound in their rotor insert manufacturing process, reducing material costs significantly while maintaining the original part number and certification markings. Augustus had found the substitution through an independent material analysis he commissioned without informing his board, and he had documented his intent to bring the evidence before the full board and notify the relevant federal oversight bodies. The handwritten note identified Hollis Wycliffe as the executive who had reviewed the supplier audit findings and approved continued use of the affected components because the cost of halting the contracts in progress was projected to produce a significant financial loss in that fiscal quarter. Serafina read the note twice, standing very still, and then set it down on the Roadster's hood without speaking. Clay waited. He had enough experience with difficult truths to know that some of them needed a minute to settle before a person could carry them. She said she believed Hollis might have made a terrible financial decision without fully understanding the safety consequence. And Clay said that was possible, and that the investigation would determine what he understood and when he understood it. The evidence was the evidence regardless of who it pointed toward. Then he turned to the flight log for the night Augustus died and pointed to a detail neither of them had focused on until that moment. Among the crew scheduled for that flight, Cyrus Vane's name had originally been listed as pilot, then crossed out and replaced by another name exactly 2 hours before departure. Hollis Wycliffe arrived on a Thursday morning with Merritt Vale, 2 additional attorneys, and a court filing that had been prepared with enough advance work to suggest it had been in progress before the hangar contents were fully documented. The filing sought a temporary restraining order on the movement or further examination of any item within the property, based on the assertion that all contents were either proprietary trade secrets or stolen corporate assets, and it named Clay as a respondent in a related civil complaint alleging unlawful possession of company property obtained through a fraudulent asset sale. Hollis was a man in his late 60s who moved with the deliberate ease of someone accustomed to entering rooms and waiting for them to adjust to his presence, and he expressed no hostility toward Clay directly. He spoke about the family's deep pain at having their private history disturbed and about the importance of protecting the integrity of Augustus's legacy from those who might seek to exploit it. The restraining order was initially granted pending a response hearing, which meant Clay could not remove, sell, or further examine the vehicles while the court reviewed the dispute, and if the order became permanent, he stood to lose access to the property indefinitely. Without access, he could not operate the repair business the property was purchased to house, and without revenue, the loan terms would eventually foreclose what remained of his investment. Hollis's team conveyed an offer through an intermediary, a sum sufficient to purchase a modest home and clear his existing debt in exchange for immediate transfer of the property contents, a signed confidentiality agreement, and voluntary withdrawal from Nevada. The sum was not trivial, and for a man who had slept in his truck 8 months ago, it was a number that could have changed the immediate material facts of his life. Clay declined in writing, which his attorney filed with the court. His stated reason was that certain items within the hangar appeared to be material evidence in a fatality investigation and could not ethically be transferred to a party with potential liability exposure in that same investigation. There was a second reason he did not file but did explain in a short phone call to Paige that evening. He told her the reason he was not taking the money was not that he was brave in some dramatic sense, but that he did not want to look back in 10 years and explain to her that he had known something important and let someone buy the knowledge away from him because he was tired of being behind. Paige told him she was not worried about money. She said she was worried about him convincing himself that failing one more time would be the thing that defined him, and that she wished he would stop thinking that way. The media coverage that followed was managed. Several outlets ran pieces describing Clay as a failed contractor attempting to leverage a grief-laden family narrative into a financial settlement, and the framing was consistent enough across sources that it had clearly been coordinated. Serafina said nothing publicly during this period, and Clay interpreted that as the reasonable position of a CEO protecting her company's market position. He did not blame her for it. Then Serafina filed a motion through her personal legal representative, separate from Wycliffe Aerospace's corporate counsel and paid through her own funds, requesting that the court order a stay on asset transfer until an independent forensic review was completed, and that the court appoint a neutral examiner rather than allowing any party to the dispute to conduct the examination themselves. Clay read the filing in the parking lot of a hardware store where he had been buying new locks for the hangar doors. He sat in his truck for a few minutes and then drove back to the property. That same night, just before midnight, he smelled something he had not expected. Aviation fuel has a particular presence, thin and sharp, carrying differently from motor oil or hydraulic fluid, and Clay knew it the way he knew the sound of a specific engine bearing failing. He traced it to the silver wren in 6 minutes, found the connection between the main fuel supply manifold and the tank outlet assembly severed in a way that could not be mistaken for deterioration, and shut the main isolation valve in the dark by feel because he already knew where it was. The hangar's primary electrical system had been cut at the external disconnect panel, at some point between 9 in the evening and his arrival at the leak, which meant the building was running on its battery backup lighting circuit, and a spark anywhere in the fuel vapor the leak had been creating would have been sufficient to turn the entire structure into evidence that no examiner could recover. He moved every vehicle away from the affected area before he called the county sheriff's office, and the responding officer spent 3 hours documenting the scene. The perimeter cameras had been deactivated by someone who used the correct override sequence for the security system, a sequence that had not been provided to Clay and was therefore either cracked by someone who had studied it or already known to someone who had worked with the original installation. The ground near the secondary access door showed boot impressions consistent with a specific type of work sole, and Laurel, who arrived the following morning, identified the tread as a pattern used in Wycliffe Aerospace's maintenance department footwear. Near the rotor housing of the Falcon test bed, she found a self-locking hex bolt of a diameter and threading specification that appeared in Wycliffe's internal maintenance tool inventory documentation, but was not a standard commercial part sold through any general supply chain. Serafina came that afternoon and stood in front of the evidence markers the sheriff's team had left. She proposed moving all vehicles to a secure corporate facility where they could be properly protected and environmentally controlled, and Clay told her he respected the offer and declined it, because any Wycliffe facility was also a facility where the materials could potentially be accessed, altered, or lost in transit. He said it as a constraint of the situation that existed independent of anyone's intention, not as an accusation. Laurel proposed a formal solution: all digital and documentary evidence to be copied and lodged with an independent forensic archive under court seal, while the physical vehicles remained at the hangar under a court-supervised arrangement with a neutral monitor. Both Clay and Serafina agreed. While they were working through the documentation the following morning, Clay noticed something behind the forward insulation panel of the Silver Wren. A flat rectangular device, roughly the size of a thick hardback book, secured against the airframe with industrial adhesive that had yellowed at the edges. It was a position logging unit, older in design, storing coordinates on a memory card rather than transmitting them, and the card was still present. The data showed a complete movement history for the Silver Wren in the final weeks before the registered date of its destruction. Maintenance flights, a transfer by ground transport, and a final log entry recorded 6 hours before the moment the official accident report stated the aircraft had gone down. In those 6 hours, according to the coordinates, the Silver Wren had been moved by truck to a private facility 80 miles from the accident site and secured inside a locked structure. The authorization code attached to the transfer log was assigned to the executive office of Hollis Wycliffe. Serafina arrived at her uncle's home without calling ahead. Hollis Wycliffe received her in his study with the practiced equanimity of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for longer than she had been preparing to have it. He acknowledged, without significant hesitation, that he had authorized the movement of the Silver Wren on the evening before Augustus's flight. He described his reasoning in careful terms. He had received information suggesting that someone within the company intended to tamper with Augustus's aircraft, and he had moved the helicopter as a protective measure and arranged for a different aircraft to be made available. He said Augustus had agreed to the substitution and that the accident was an outcome no one had anticipated, and he said he had carried the weight of it for 17 years. Clay had not been present, but Laurel had pulled the maintenance records for the substitute aircraft and shared her analysis with him and Serafina by the following morning. The logs for the aircraft that went down showed it had been prepared with a full complement of passenger-configured interior fittings and a standard fuel load appropriate for a direct routing flight to the meeting location. It had not been configured as a test aircraft. A pilot who voluntarily chose to conduct an in-flight rotor evaluation would request a reduced fuel load, remove non-essential interior weight, and file a different flight plan. None of those things had occurred, and every operational decision made around that flight by the people who prepared it was consistent with a passenger flight and inconsistent with the explanation that had stood for 17 years. Inside the communications module of the Roadster, Laurel found a voice recording stored on a separate media chip beneath the factory unit, one that Augustus had made in the vehicle several days before he died, speaking directly and quietly to Cyrus Vane. Augustus's voice on that recording was unhurried and precise. He described the component substitution, named North Star Dynamics, and said that Hollis had been presented with the complete analysis and had directed him in a private conversation to sign a document certifying the components as meeting original specification. He said he would not sign the document. He said the meeting the following morning was intended to force the matter into the open before the affected components were installed in any additional aircraft. He said he had asked Cyrus to protect the machines and the documents if the board meeting did not produce the outcome he expected. The recording ended in the middle of a sentence, stopped before Augustus named the person who had proposed the aircraft substitution, as though the device had reached its capacity or been deliberately ended. Merritt Vale appeared the following afternoon with a motion arguing that the recording and all associated documentation should be declared inadmissible because the discovery had occurred in property whose ownership remained under active dispute. Clay's attorney filed an opposition. The court agreed to provisionally preserve the evidence pending resolution of the title question, and that resolution, it turned out, was sitting in the bankruptcy file in a sealed envelope that had been logged into the court record and never opened, filed under a case subcode that no one had checked until Clay's attorney requested a full physical document audit. The envelope had been in the bankruptcy administrator's archive for the entire duration of the dispute. It was marked for court opening only in the event of an ownership dispute, sealed with a wax impression that the court document examiner confirmed was consistent with the personal seal maintained by Augustus Wycliffe's private office, and it had been filed 3 days before his death with a court-certified timestamp. The contents were 3 pages. The first was a written instrument transferring custody of 12 specified vehicles, each identified by chassis number and tail number, to Cyrus Vane for the exclusive purpose of conducting an independent safety analysis under conditions of custodial confidentiality. The second was a supplemental authorization granting Cyrus the right to maintain possession beyond the initial custody period if, in his judgment, the investigation was being interfered with by any party connected to Wycliffe Aerospace. The third was a short personal note in which Augustus wrote that he did not believe he was being dramatic in making these arrangements, but that he had learned in 30 years of engineering work that a man who takes precautions he never needs has lost nothing, while a man who needed precautions and did not take them loses everything. Augustus had signed all 3 pages in his capacity as Chief Executive Officer, which gave the instrument its legal standing against any competing corporate claim on the listed assets. Cyrus had received the vehicles through a documented chain of custody, which meant he had not stolen them, and when Cyrus died without heirs or a designated successor, the vehicles had entered a legal gray area that eventually resolved through the bankruptcy sale, and Clay had purchased them through a process that, while complicated, had a defensible title chain back to a legitimate source. Hollis's strategy had depended on the proposition that Cyrus had removed assets without authorization, and that argument was now facing direct contradiction from a court-certified document signed by the man Hollis claimed to have been protecting. Serafina invoked a provision in the company charter allowing the sitting CEO to call an emergency board session in circumstances affecting the company's legal exposure, and Hollis moved immediately to build opposition among the shareholders, contacting them directly and framing the situation as a grieving daughter, allowing personal emotion to put $17 billion in enterprise value at risk because of a single father who had stumbled onto a complicated situation and chosen to make it more complicated. Clay heard about the contacts through Serafina and told her he did not want her to carry his portion of this. She said the matter had stopped being about him or her father some time ago. There were thousands of vehicles and aircraft currently operating with components supplied by Northstar Dynamics under the affected certification standards, and the question of what to do about that was not a personal question but a public one, and she intended to treat it that way. Clay said he understood and that he would support whatever she needed from the hangar and its contents. Before the board meeting the following Thursday, Laurel completed her final analysis of the Falcon testbed's rotor assembly and confirmed that the component installed on the hub belonged to the same production batch as the part number recorded in the destroyed aircraft's maintenance log. The same batch, the same alloy deviation, the same failure mode. She presented her findings to both of them in the hangar office that evening, and neither Clay nor Serafina said anything for a while after she finished. The public examination was held at the hangar property on the appointed Thursday under a joint order from the court and the Federal Aviation Administration, with independent monitors from the Aviation Safety Authority, a panel of 3 forensic engineers not associated with any party to the dispute, and a group of Wycliffe Aerospace's institutional shareholders who had exercised their right to observe under the company's governance charter. Laurel Ames conducted the primary technical presentation, drawing on the rotor assembly from the Falcon testbed, the metallurgical records Augustus had collected, the documentary materials from the Roadster's hidden compartment, and a set of material samples from the accident site that had been preserved in a federal evidence archive for 17 years without being re-examined. The comparison was methodical, and the language was precise. The rotor insert in the Falcon testbed showed a consistent pattern of alloy composition that differed from the specification on its certification, marking at 2 points in the material matrix, and the same deviation appeared in the samples from the accident site. The deviation was not a manufacturing defect in the traditional sense. It appeared in a specific location in the bonding structure, corresponding to the maximum stress point during sustained high-speed rotor operation, and the failure mode it produced was consistent with a progressive fracture under load rather than an immediate break. An aircraft with this component installed could complete multiple flights before the fracture propagated to the point of structural failure, making it essentially impossible to detect without metallurgical analysis, and very difficult to detect in any standard pre-flight inspection. Clay presented the position logging data in sequence, walking the room through the movement history of the Silver Wren and the timeline of the substitute aircraft's preparation. He showed the authorization codes from the transfer log and connected them to the office record they matched. He showed the fuel and maintenance configuration of the aircraft that went down and explained, in the straightforward language of someone who had spent his career interpreting technical documents for clients who were not engineers, why that configuration was inconsistent with a voluntary test flight by any pilot of reasonable experience. The room followed him. The room had been following him since the second slide. Merritt Vale, when given the opportunity to present the opposing position, spoke for 11 minutes, and then said she wished to make a statement of clarification rather than a legal argument. She said she had received instructions, at various points over the preceding years, to restrict access to specific documents, and to ensure that certain analytical requests did not result in formal reports, and that she had followed those instructions, believing she was managing the company's regulatory exposure in the ordinary course of legal practice. She said she no longer believed that, and she provided the court monitor with a secured drive containing approximately 4 years of internal communications from Hollis Wickliffe's executive account, preserved separately from the company's primary archive system. The board voted that afternoon to suspend Hollis from all positions, void his voting rights, and refer the matter to the appropriate federal authorities with a full copy of the evidence compiled during the Hangar review. Hollis did not speak during the vote. Serafina called the result and moved immediately to the next agenda item. The public statement Serafina issued the following Monday was not the one her communications team had drafted. It was shorter and more direct, and it committed to 3 things that no communications professional would have recommended: a full suspension of all active contracts involving Northstar Dynamics components pending independent recertification, a voluntary recall notification to every operator of Wickliffe, supplied systems using the affected batch designations, and the public release of the complete internal investigation record, including the materials that showed the company's prior knowledge of the risk. The share price dropped significantly in the first 2 sessions after the announcement, but it did not collapse. The institutional holders had made their peace with the disclosure before it came, and the clients who remained were the ones who had been told the truth before events required it, and they stayed. The federal investigation proceeded through the following months without drama and with a great deal of paperwork. Augustus Wickliffe's name was formally cleared in a supplemental accident report that identified the causal chain with the precision of a document written by people who had been waiting 17 years for the complete record. The correction did not undo the loss, and Serafina never spoke publicly about what it meant to her to read it. Clay saw her face when she read the summary in his Hangar office, and he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The vehicles were resolved through a process that took close to a year to complete. The Silver Wren was returned to Serafina through a voluntary transfer agreement completed in a single afternoon meeting. The Falcon testbed went to a non-profit aviation safety museum after the investigation closed. The 3rd helicopter, the old rescue machine Cyrus had used to move equipment across the desert, Clay rebuilt himself over the winter and donated to a search and rescue organization serving the surrounding counties. 3 Vesper prototypes were acquired by Wickliffe Aerospace at a court-assessed fair value, the proceeds going to Clay after legal costs were settled. The 6 remaining vehicles were registered through individual title proceedings and sold through a reputable auction house, with documentation that made their history a feature rather than a liability. Clay Arden opened Arden Desert Aviation and Motors on a clear morning in early spring, with a new sign over the main hangar door, a freshly graded access road, and a staff that included Laurel Ames as independent certification consultant and 2 mechanics who had been released from their Wickliffe contracts after raising safety concerns in writing during the prior year. Page moved into the small house behind the hangar that same week, carrying boxes in from a borrowed truck and complaining about the dust in a tone of voice that did not contain a single trace of actual complaint. Serafina drove out to collect the Silver Wren on a Saturday in late April, alone, and she and Clay stood in the hangar for a while after the formal paperwork was done, without needing to speak about anything that required documentation. Clay told her that her father's true legacy was not the machines he built or the company he founded. It was the decision he made in the last days of his life not to sign his name to a lie. Serafina thanked him, and she flew the Silver Wren out over the desert as the afternoon light came down flat and gold across the valley floor. Clay watched it go from the hangar doorway, the sound of the rotors fading until the desert took it, and stood for a long time in the quiet thinking about a single father who had walked through this same door looking for one last chance to start over, and who had found 12 machines he could not sell, and understood now, in that silence, that the most valuable thing in that desert hangar had never been the 9 supercars or the silver helicopter. It had been the truth that someone refused to let burn.